Welcome back to Control the Freak. Today we're going to look at attachment theory and how that relates to controlling behaviour. So this is going to be quite related to long-term influence. And when I first started looking at controlling behaviour and I was trying to understand why I was the way I was and what I was doing, I looked at loads of studies and lectures and things like that to try and see if there was something that I recognised that could help me change the way I was behaving that would make some sense to me. Basically asking, was it nature or was it nurture? What had happened to me to make me this way? Or was I just that way? I was pretty confident it was a mixture of nurture and the events that had happened in my life coming together to create the type of person that I'd become. But I was also kind of aware that I wasn't necessarily the best place to make an objective judgment on that, because I was still quite capable of twisting logic to suit my narrative. So I knew I kind of had to look elsewhere for a little bit of advice. One of the first theories I came across was attachment theory. And for a little while, this one kind of grabbed me. It started to make quite a bit more sense than some of the other ones. As I said in my events episode, our house was pretty chaotic even before my stepdad ever arrived. I wouldn't say it was really bad, but it was busy and it was chaotic. My mum had been left with 8 kids to raise while my biological father had run off before my stepdad ever appeared. And she'd met that guy when she was 14 and he was in the Canadian Air Force, stationed over here. He'd picked himself this little 14-year-old girl up. He was in his early 20s. And he basically kind of whisked her off. But he kind of zeroed in on her because she was a naive 14-year-old. That's what this guy was like. And she ended up being kind of dragged around the world to different places while he was free to go off and do what he wanted. By the time I was born, there was 8 kids of all ranges, from sort of 1 and 2 years old as me and my sister, right up to late teens. We all lived with my mum in a 3-bed house in the north of England. We had no money, not much in common, and my biological father was missing as usual. One of the reasons we didn't have much in common was our upbringing. Apart from me and the next sister up to me, the rest of them had all grown up in Africa, where they'd had big house, help, guard dogs, and they had some mad stories where the help and the younger kids would clean the wooden floors in the house by strapping blocks of wax to their feet and skating around the house. That's how they'd polish the floors. And there were stories about them coming into contact with people like Idi Amin and things like that. So they had quite an exotic upbringing. Now, they're transplanted to a place in the north of England with its sort of dark grey skies, no money, cramped in a 3-bed house, no dogs, no help. And so my slightly older sister and I were completely removed from these people. We had nothing in common with them. But they also had their own adjustments to make as well, because now they had to adjust from this big house in Africa with guard dogs to this tiny little house. And they all kind of splintered off in different directions, and they all got very different personalities. You had kind of timid, you had loud but not very confident, you had aggressive, you had very aggressive, particularly one of my older sisters. One of my older brothers got into some kind of substances. All these single problems that they had while they were trying to adjust to their new life in the north of England. And they didn't have any time really to relate to me and my sister. They didn't have much choice, because one of the things that my mum did was kind of palm us off to the older siblings. In a way, she didn't have much choice. As I say, there was no money coming in. She had a job in a pub over the road that she would go over there and cook the meals for everybody in there. And so she left a lot of the childcare to my siblings. As I say, we had nothing in common whatsoever. But if there was distance between me and my siblings, the distance between me and my mum was just as big, but for very different reasons. As I say, we go back to the story of my biological dad. He'd swooped in on her when she was just a teenager and just kind of dragged her around the world, every now and again sticking a kid in her. So she was still a child while she was still giving birth to children. She never really got a chance to grow up. She never really got the chance to want children. She had no choice in the matter. This guy was a bad guy in lots of ways I can't go into here. But she never really got the chance to grow up. And as a result, this was just forced on her, this lifestyle, and I don't think she ever truly adjusted to it. So if there was a distance between me and my siblings, the distance between me and the next sister to me and my mum was probably even bigger. There was a period where I thought it was quite a good thing because I thought it gave me some independence. I would go off for walks in the woods and that miles away from our village. And I was only 6 or 7 years old, and it's not the kind of thing you do anymore. You thought of a 6 or 7-year-old child going off for walks a couple of miles away on their own and coming back at the end of the day when it was dark. I think we'd all kind of shiver at the thought of that. But I was kind of left to my own devices. Mum wasn't there, she was working, or she was kind of detached anyway. And siblings weren't interested, so I'd go off and do those things. And I thought that this was a good result of that detachment. I thought it gave me some independence. I was quite good with strangers, but I knew when to reel it in and to back off. I could kind of sense danger. It made me quite streetwise in a lot of ways. As I got older, though, I started to look back on that, and I didn't see that independence quite so much as a benefit as kind of a bad outcome of that detachment from my mum. And like every control freak, I was looking for reasons as to why I was the way I was. And if I'm honest, at the time, I was looking for somebody to blame. This was when I was just starting to understand the control problem. And I knew that I had one, and I knew I had to identify it and fix it. But I'm trying to think, whose fault is this? We'll come back to that a little bit later on, because that changes the more you start to understand this stuff. But it was then that I came across attachment theory. I'll give you a little background to attachment theory now, and hopefully this will explain why I've just told you a little bit more about my backstory so that you can understand the relationship between me and my parents. You already know that the relationship between me and my stepdad was awful. It was violent, it was coercive. He wasn't very nice to me and my sister at all. But I've shared a little bit more there about the relationship between me and my mum, and there's that detachment thing there. So I'll give you a little bit of background on attachment theory before we jump into it. Attachment theory was created by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. Now, John Bowlby's history was that he came from quite a wealthy family, and so he had a nanny right up until about the age of 11 or 12, I think it was, whereby his family's finances kind of got a little bit worse and they had to let the nanny go. John Bowlby was devastated by this. He absolutely adored his nanny. That's what started his interest in psychology, because he recognised that something was happening to him, how sad he was about his nanny going. So he started looking into the way people attach to each other. It wasn't called attachment theory yet. One of the first studies he did he was one of the first people to notice that baby ducks will imprint on the first face they see. And that's why you'll see quite a few videos now on YouTube where people have got little baby ducklings chasing them around, following them around everywhere. And that's because that's the first face they've seen when they came out of the egg. They've imprinted. And John Bowlby was one of the first people to identify this phenomenon. Then Second World War comes around, and there was a time when it was so dangerous, there was bombs coming over here, that families were starting to send their children off to other families in the countryside. And John Bowlby started investigating what was happening psychologically to the children that were being separated from their parents. One of the things he noticed was thieving, robbing. There was quite a lot of these young children that, when they were settled with their parents, were perfectly good children. But after separation, being sent to these families in the country, they started a habit of thieving and stealing. So he started looking more at the parental and child attachment. Then he started working for the World Health Organization, and he studied it much more in depth. He was really looking at the difference between healthy caregiver/child relationships and unhealthy caregiver/child relationships. Mary Ainsworth comes into the picture, but she had her own theories about attachment. In fact, she came up with a theory called the strange situation, and there's quite a few videos about this on YouTube, where you have a young child sat in a room with a caregiver, usually a parent, and every now and again they'll swap places with a complete stranger. And it's the study of how the child reacts to the complete stranger versus their parents. And it's quite interesting to watch. Some kids automatically adjust. My boy used to. My boy was the smiliest baby you've ever seen, and you could put him in front of a stranger and he'd just have a beaming smile on his face. But I've seen other kids, and obviously we've all experienced other kids, where you'll go up and you'll say hello and they just recoil or they'll start screaming. And she investigated that quite heavily. As I say, it was called the strange situation. And eventually her and Bowlby get together and they come up with attachment theory. Now, it's worth saying here that they weren't straight away embraced by the psychological community or psychoanalytical community. People were quite skeptical about all of this because around that time, the books and the advice that was given about how to treat children was things like pat them on the head if they've done well. You may kiss them once on the forehead if they've done really well. Never let them sit on your lap. It was all about keeping your distance from your children. So when they were advocating for a strong connection between parent and child, most of the psychoanalytical community pushed them away and said, no, this is a load of rubbish. But attachment theory nowadays is starting to regain some ground. And that's why I wanted to touch on it today. And I'm going to have to read some notes here when I do this because I'm getting older now, we've got a very good memory, so bear with me. So the 4 attachment categories are, beginning with secure. These children had/have nurturing caregivers who responded with support when they were upset. They provide an organised and reliable structure that the children need, and the environment is comfortable with intimacy. And this leads to the adults being able to be honest and stable in relationships as they've grown up. Adults brought up in this environment have a positive self-view and a positive view of their relationships. They're good communicators and reliable friends. Second category is anxious. And these people were neglected in childhood and often made to feel bad for the worries and their concerns. And this leads to them needing more attention and intimacy, both as they grow and into adulthood. So as adults, they need more external fulfillment of their needs, and they tend to worry about whether or not they are loved pretty constantly. They've got a negative view of themselves, and this can lead to distinct highs and lows in their relationship. Their nervous system's on high alert around people they care about for fear of what they see as an inevitable rejection at some point down the line. Third category is avoidant. And these people had caregivers who ignored the child's emotional needs, or in some cases, even concentrated on distracting them from their emotional needs. And this sometimes even manifested as making fun of their problems. You know, when a child hurts themselves, you just laugh at them and you think that that's a good distraction. It's not always the case. The caregivers disrupt the fundamental structures that children rely on for healthy mental development. The children are often told that reliance and dependence on the caregiver is a sign of weakness. As adults, they will distance themselves from others, and they can feel overwhelmed by intimacy as well. There's a feeling that a lack of emotional attachment provides some kind of safety for them. So they can send mixed signals to partners. They can be affectionate one minute and then pull back suddenly, and partners can often be left confused by that. But they can be overwhelmed suddenly by a fear that this isn't good for me to get this close. The adults often feel positive about themselves in some ways, but negative about others. And the final category is disorganised. And these people are a mix of anxious and avoidant, and it's sometimes called fearful avoidant. And they're often the product of caregivers who have been traumatised themselves. And that means that the caregivers end up providing inconsistent or sometimes inappropriate reassurance. And that can lead to these kids being preoccupied with reassurance from the caregiver. They're always looking for that little nugget of something good, and it can be a bit of an obsession for them. But the caregivers are often a source of fear and or confusion, as I say, because most of the time they've been traumatised themselves in some ways. As adults, children raised in this environment tend to have a distrust of others. They're erratic in relationships and can suddenly disengage if things get intense and uncomfortable for them. But at other times, they'll seek closeness. This is a feeling that a lack of emotional attachment provides safety, again, but they can also be clingy and desperate. You see how this is a mix of two types, so you've got one extreme to the other. These people can often be uncomfortably direct and at other times over emotional in communication about how they feel. As adults, they have both low self worth and a low opinion of others. So that's the 4 attachment theories. Have a look at that and see what you think. I would recommend to anybody suffering with control to have a little look at attachment theory. I don't think it's the be all and end all. I'll come to that in a second. However, I do know some people who I've looked at attachment theory, I've then looked at their life, and it's pretty clear that you can draw direct lines between the caregiver and the child when you apply the attachment theory types. I do think there's some value in it. I also think there's some value in it if you're somebody who suffered with a controlling partner, because you might be able to, again, draw those lines between caregiver type, the child, and the adult they went on to be. And you never know, it might also explain why you ended up choosing a control freak. I think it has its uses, but as I say, I don't think it's a be-all and end-all. It doesn't take into account children who have had all of the nurturing of the secure type, but they've never been taught to learn how to adapt to difficult consequences. In other words, they've been spoiled, they've never been questioned, there's been too much love. And sometimes that creates a child who ends up being a real narcissist and a bit of a problem, and generally ends up having a control issue as well. I worry that some controlling people will go to attachment theory in the way that they do other personality tests. I did. I went looking for excuses, as I said early on. I went looking for excuses as to why I was the way I was. And that's what you go looking for. You're going to find it. You're going to find a personality type there or an attachment theory type and go, that's why I am the way I am. And you'll do what every control freak does. You'll say, that's why I'm the way I am. Now I have permission to carry on being this way because it's not my fault. Remember, that's what control freaks do all of the time. So I would advise approaching it with caution. You're not looking for excuses, you're looking for help. Finally, it doesn't account for high impact events. I've known plenty of people who are perfectly reasonable, balanced individuals who've had a high impact event that's changed them forever. So you can have this attachment type of secure that creates a great child, but it doesn't explain why that child will be turned 180 by an external event. Sure, you can look at some of those attachment types and say, well, yeah, that kind of child would definitely be more susceptible to a high impact event because they're disorganized or anxious or whatever. But it doesn't explain how you'll get perfectly reasonable, healthy children with healthy parent relationships, and they will turn around on a dime and become extremely controlling as a result of a high impact event. But I suppose you can't cover everything. Overall, I would say that attachment theory is very interesting and it has some merit. So, what about attachment theory and me? I think I'm disorganized. I think if you look at my personality type, what happened to me in my childhood, it's kind of all there. I could have incredibly low self-esteem, really low self-esteem, and then at other times a strangely inflated sense of self-esteem. I think that was a coping mechanism most of the time, though. I didn't like people. I had a low opinion of people. But again, I've explained that when it came to my stepdad, I started subconsciously identifying people that would set him off. And as a result, I would reject those people as well because I knew that had implications for me. If I brought that person around, if he set eyes on them, there was always going to be a bad outcome for the family. He also reinforced the idea that love and affection made you soft and it was a sign of weakness. So, again, I look at all of these types and I think, if anything, I fall under the disorganised. Particularly when it came to the influence of my mum. She, again, was all about too much love and affection is a sign of weakness. I don't ever remember getting a cuddle off my mum. I'm not getting the violins out here. I'm just saying there was that detachment. Don't ever remember getting a cuddle. Don't remember getting a kiss. She seemed not really interested and seemed to not like me very much. I don't know how true that is. It's hard to say, isn't it? I know she had a very difficult life. I know that she was swooped up by a much older guy, dragged around the world and just had babies stuffed in her again and again. I don't think she had the chance to grow up. That guy was a bad guy, as I've said before. And I don't know if she ever managed to develop into the adult she might have been had she not gone through that. So I'm not blaming my mum. I did an episode on Control Freak Recovery, which was Mirror Gallagher Rally. And right at the end of that episode, I talked about forgiveness. And I said about how I'd had to forgive my stepdad. I looked at what he'd been through. He'd had an awful childhood with just a catastrophic event when he was very, very young, which would shape anybody. And when I started looking at that, it was quite easy to see how that ended up making him become the person he was, which was not very nice. But I could understand it. I think it would have shaped most people to become the kind of person he did. And I also realised that if I'm stood here trying to say it's not my fault, I'm this way, it's because of him, then if that works for me, it's got to work for him. It's not his fault that he was that way. It's because of what happened to him when he was growing up. And if you carry on following that logic, you might get to a better place. But flip side to that is if you carry on blaming everybody, at some point, that's going to come back around to you. There's going to be somebody who's going to be able to point the finger at you and say you're to blame. The only way I could get away from this was to forgive my stepdad. When I looked at attachment theory, as I say, I went into it looking for excuses. But if anything, I actually understood my mum a little bit more because she was a traumatized caregiver. If you look at one of those types there, she had an awful start to her young life. So again, I found forgiveness for my mum. I never hated her anyway. Hate's a pretty strong word. I don't know what I felt for her, but there was a detachment there, as I say, all my life. Anyway, I hope that's some use to you. We might come back to attachment theory again because I think there's something to be taken from it, but hopefully there's something in there for you. In the meantime, I'm going to leave you with the usual: control the freak, not other people. I'll see you next time. Behave.